Hi, I'm Mike Cashion, a lawyer with Cashion Legal. We are a litigation and employment law firm based in Calgary, Alberta. If your employment was recently terminated for cause and you want to know more about what cause is and whether your employer actually had cause to terminate your employment and what your options might be, in this video, I'm going to run through some of the basic concepts of termination for cause. And by the end of the video, you're going to have a better understanding about whether you should speak to a lawyer about your situation. If your employment has been terminated for cause, it means that your employer has identified some act of misconduct that gave rise to their right to terminate your employment without notice and without pay in lieu of notice. When someone's employment is terminated without cause, they generally receive notice or pay in lieu of notice, what we commonly refer to as severance. However, if the employee has done something that the employer can point to as being a fundamental breach of the employment relationship, the employer is then entitled to terminate the employment for cause and deny paying the employee any compensation in connection with the termination of their employment. Unfortunately, in certain situations, employers are incentivized to terminate for cause. If the employee has substantial severance entitlements and has engaged in some kind of misconduct which might be cause, the employer then has an incentive to terminate for cause and avoid paying that severance to the employee. It's important to know that the circumstances where an employer can terminate for cause are actually very, very limited. It's only serious misconduct that gives rise to the right to terminate an employee's employment for cause. So it can't just be any act of misconduct. It must be a serious act of misconduct that undermines the employment relationship. There are certain things which generally do give rise to the right to terminate for cause, including theft, serious acts of dishonesty, or physical aggression towards colleagues. Even if it's a first-time offense, there is a strong likelihood in any one of those situations that an employee's employment can be validly terminated for cause. This is to be contrasted with different situations where the employee breaches lesser terms of the employment relationship that don't necessarily give right to the right to terminate for cause right away. For example, if an employee engages in insubordinate behavior or if they're late. Those are the kind of things where an employer cannot necessarily terminate for cause if they've only happened once. If an employer wants to terminate for cause in any one of those situations, they generally have to penalize the employee after the first offense in writing and confirm with the employee that further instances of that offense will result in termination for cause. And in some scenarios, they have to do that once, twice, or 3 times before they can actually terminate for cause. In those situations dealing with lesser misconduct, the courts have recognized that termination for cause is such an onerous remedy that they don't want to allow employers to just immediately terminate for cause on the first instance of that misconduct. They want to give employees the opportunity to rectify their behavior in those situations. In addition to the seriousness of the offense, there are a whole bunch of other considerations that are important when assessing whether an employee can be terminated for cause, including the employee's position. Like if the employee is in a heightened position of responsibility, they're going to be held to a higher standard. Alternatively, the employee's length of service with the employer might be considered. If the employee has a long history of service to the employer and an unblemished record, that might mitigate against terminating for cause. Effectively, there are many other facts and considerations that can play into whether termination for cause is justified in any one situation. If an employee's employment is terminated for cause, they are not entitled to severance. However, sometimes employers still offer severance to an employee when they are terminating for cause. In that situation, it's likely that what the employer is doing is alleging just cause in order to give themselves a stronger position in any potential severance negotiations. So if an employer is both terminating for cause but offering severance, that should give the employee pause about thinking, well, hey, does the employer really have cause in this situation, or are they just trying to reframe the negotiations before they've even begun? There are a number of different ways that you can normally challenge a for-cause termination. One of the ways is to question the evidence presented by your employer. Whenever an employee is terminated for cause, the onus is on the employer to provide evidence to substantiate the termination for cause. So if the employer is relying on evidence that is flawed or inherently biased against the employee, you can prove that the employer didn't have cause to terminate your employment. Another common way to challenge a for-cause termination is to point out that the employer never warned the employee that the specific misconduct could result in the termination of employment. In that scenario, depending on the type of misconduct, the courts may find that termination for cause is not justified in the circumstances. Another way to dispute a for-cause termination is to show that the employer did not act quickly enough to address the specific misconduct. If the employee has engaged in that specific misconduct in the past and the employer didn't take any steps in that past situation, the employee can say, well, hey, I thought there was no problem with me doing this because nothing happened the last time I did this. Because termination for cause is such an emotionally charged situation, speaking with an employment lawyer can provide you with perspective and clarity about your circumstances. Because being terminated for cause doesn't have to be a defining event of your life, and it doesn't even have to be a roadblock for your career. If after watching this video you still have questions about the termination of your employment, book a consultation with our office today.